So the question is, for all of us, how do we get our voices heard? I think you spoke about being participatory and collaborative, but how do we? So that's a question I'm going to ask now, because if we want to be able to engage with that question, are we ready? Then we've got to pay forward. If we're talking about resilience doesn't happen. We have to plant the seeds. I always say that there's basically two questions here. One question is, what do we need to do and how are we going to do it? And that's engineering. That's basically, we know how to do that. But the other question is, what sort of organization or what sort of society do we think we need to become? The things you were talking about, Sherrod, are alluding to, as a society, we need to see transformation. We need to sort of live in such a way that it is appropriate to the risks we're facing. In the UK, we have SAGE, which is a scientific advisory group for emergencies, which was triggered at the beginning of COVID. That has 56 experts on it. And not one single person has a background in crisis management. Not one. They have economists and sociologists and epidemiologists, but nobody who says, well, this is how you run a crisis, because there are ways that you run a crisis. So I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if we're going to take the overview, let's start off with the overview. It's like mapping. You start wide, you come in. So let's start with the overview. How do we ensure that the appropriate conversations are being had? Andrew, I'm sure that you've got some answers. We're all waiting to write down the answers, so please do give us the answer for that.
So I think one of the things that's always interesting is the way we're using language. Yeah. So when we talk about a crisis, I often hear people start talking about fires and floods, which are important. But if you're reliant on a supply chain and the Panama Canal is not getting enough water, that can be a crisis for you, and you're miles away from it because your supply chain's now compromised. And I think it is Natalia has raised some really interesting points there about crisis management is not an operational concern. I think this is where a lot of people get very confused. So they immediately go to the operational people and say, we need you to fix this, and that's great, but you haven't defined what the problem is. It's, you guys understand command and control, which may or may not be the appropriate response. I actually work with one organisation, and many of us will have standard operating procedures. They have non-standard operating procedures. So when something happens and they say, this is not something with which we are familiar, so not saying it's unprecedented, we're just not familiar with it, we go to the non-standard operating procedure book. And we start bringing a different group of people together, and they're not the ones that we would normally bring together. We want a bit of diversity in that. How much diversity? Some of them are applying the Danish model of having a Pandora cell with a forward-looking capability. They've got different timelines set. So the way they start thinking about the problem is different to, this is a fire, we know a fire, we will respond to the fire. So there's a fundamental question there about language and the way we use language. We now do have an international standard on crisis management. So there is an international standard definition. Whether everybody uses that definition is a separate issue. So I think one of the questions for many senior decision makers is, where does this fit with the other 5 crises that I'm dealing with today? So if many countries are dealing with inflation and a cost of living crisis, and the media does love to call everything a crisis. And I think one of the other things in that space is we use a lot of analogical reasoning, which makes us lazy. So there will be other people on the discussion today who have served in war zones. We do love in Australia to talk about war zones, like the bushfire. It looked like a war zone. I've fought bushfires and I've been in war zones. I don't remember the soldiers standing around and saying this looks like a bushfire. So we use these analogies because they're easy to use, but they are academically lazy, and we're not encouraging people to think. So it's one of the default actions here, and probably in a lot of places, is we'll call in military people and get them to help us solve it. And we talk about black swan events, and one of the reasons I'm such a huge fan of the book, The Black Swan, is not just because it talks about Western Australia where I grew up in black swans, and I hadn't seen a white swan until I was 16. I only really knew black swans until I was 16. But Talib actually talks about there are very few organisations that actually train in adaptive planning. There are very few organisations that are genuinely dealing with uncertain events. There are very few organisations that are dealing with highly complex interactions. So that's not what most people take away from his book. What most people take away from his book is when bad things happen, we weren't prepared for them, or we chose not to allocate assets to them. We'll call that a black swan. So for our decision makers, if you're a prime minister or head of a jurisdiction, you've got multiple things that you're trying to look at, and you're trying to work out where does this particular hazard that a particular group is bringing to me fit. So even in a lot of countries where you've got those that are dealing with so-called natural hazards as opposed to terrorist threats, they're trying to work out where do I allocate that funding. And we do like to learn a good solid lesson rather than take the concept. So a lot of our lessons work is not about conceptually what did we learn from that, and how can we apply that in multiple areas, and how do I now allocate resources to that. It's about last time the fire did this, so we'll not build houses there. We'll build them somewhere else. Oh, that's a floodplain, they flooded. Well, we built them in the wrong. The fundamental question is, where are good places to build houses so that they're not at risk, and therefore their occupants aren't at risk, therefore you don't lose shelter. I think the other thing that's worth thinking about is the environment. We love to talk about the environment. As soon as you build a house, the environment changes. You put a hard surface above what was previously earth in many cases, might have been rock, so it changes the way the water flows. You then build an entire city, you provide roads, all that has impact on where water flows and what it's going to do. Some of that can be modelled by engineers under certain circumstances. I do like working with engineers because they recognise that systems are designed for certain parameters, change the parameters and the system may not work. And I think these are some of the fundamental questions we've got to come back to. As we change our environment, what are the ramifications for that? And you've heard me say on many occasions, I've reached a point where I'm tired of hearing about climate change. The climate has changed. It's going to change again. That is something we now need to manage. We can't go back and say, in pre-industrial times, this is how things happened. Like, we don't live in those times anymore. We live in a different set of times. We've got to use the tools that are appropriate to us today. And it comes back to your comment before, are we using analog terms for what is now a digital society? We're still coming to grips here with issues around cyber, and one of the things that's people are coming to grips with, it doesn't really matter whether it's a cyber attack or whether it's a patch failure. When you lose comms, and you've got to deal with that. So we're starting to broaden some of those things out, and they're those conceptual issues around consequence, and they do require a higher level of thinking. They do require people who think more systemically, and how is all this going to flow? But then how do you make that concrete? And my final comment on this one is around, we all know Donald Rumsfeld and his known knowns and his known unknowns. The one thing we frequently talk about is, what is the unknown known? So what is the thing I don't know that somebody else will know? So I don't know much about nuclear physics, but I know there are people out there who know about nuclear physics. So if we want to talk about a nuclear event, they need to be at the table and not to have a group of pick a particular hazard sat there saying, I think this is what that's going to look like.
Andrew, oh my God, we're going to have to extend this session by about 3 hours, I think, just to answer the points. Just a couple of points that I put down. The language, I agree with language, and we tend to think of it militaristically. There's an interesting conversation we had within the ISRM and the Global Crisis Watch about, in COVID, whether female leadership was different from male leadership. But one of the things that was clear was that pretty well every male leader went almost immediately to a military metaphor. We will defeat COVID. And I remember us having this conversation. Boris Johnson saying, we will defeat COVID. No, you won't. You won't defeat COVID. Because that's the wrong metaphor. It's like defeating spring or defeating the west wind. You're not going to do that. Second thing about language. And of course, anybody who knows me, you're not allowed to use the phrase black swan around me, because black swan does not mean most people think about black swan means I wasn't paying attention, mate. I really wasn't paying attention. I much prefer Michelle Booker's idea of the grey rhino. But talking about language and as it evolves, I remember when VUCA came into play, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and suddenly everybody thought this was an incredibly brilliant breakthrough and it reconceptualized what we understood about complex risk. That's now been superseded by BANI rather, which is brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. And what it does is it's just bringing this, again, this greater idea of chaos. And I think that that's what we're seeing. I see across our world, we are seeing systems that we've depended on and trusted for the last 70 years, let's say since the end of the Second World War, which is basically the historical period we're in now. And we're seeing those systems fall apart for whatever reason. But those systems are falling apart. Then we can no longer trust them. And so the question, what happens is then how do we prepare for that? I'm going to ask you because I mean, Andrew, I know you have, but Avgoustinos and Sherrod, and myself, we've all got this academic background. Avgoustinos, do you believe that bringing the universities into the conversation, bringing the academics into the conversation, does that add value? Because we've been seeing, the work of Lagardère and Boyne and some of the people, the people who I grew up on as an academic in the 90s and the 2000s, they've been around for 30 years. And the question is, well, has it made a difference? I mean, have these guys had an impact? So both within your own career and capabilities and your own environment, but also conceptually, has the academic world made a contribution to our understanding of the world we live in now and how we deal with it?
I think it's kicking off the last few years, thankfully. I am a practitioner, and I want to see the scientific community engaging more with us, the practitioners, because we want the knowledge that we can apply on the fireground. When I say the fireground, for those who don't know, this is the scene of operations of a fire. There are immense lessons that we can learn from the scientific community and insights that we cannot find from our operational environment. We have seen a climax of this interaction, especially in Europe. I'm not aware of the other parts of the world, but in Europe, we see utilizing EU-funded programs that there is this tendency to mix and interact with the practitioners, the scientific community. It's kicking off to start and communicate with the practitioners and utilize tools from the lab out to the fireground. This is not always possible, but there are many insights that we can utilize and lessons that we can learn, we can implement back to the fireground. Because fires are changing. No, I will agree with Andrew, the climate crisis. Fires have changed. They're bigger, they're aggressive, so we need to adapt to this new era, this new regime of extreme wildfires. So I'll go back to what we said about the community language and etc. The thing that worries me greatly is the time frame. I think I will not say we're late, but we need to move very fast to start communicate the risk to the community members, because there is a lack of transparency and lack of communication with regards to what is the risks and what will be the consequences of events in the years following. We want not to fear people of what potentially can happen in the future, but by citing certain risks by them, we are overly exposing them to potential catastrophes that can happen. So we want communities to be resilient. We want communities and to be ready to face these events, but without communicated in the proper language, we will fail to do so. And when I say language, there are three kinds of languages. So it's the language of the scientific community, the language of the practitioners, and the language of the common people, the society. So people in the society maybe cannot comprehend the scientific language and the practitioner's language. So it is imperative to get the data from all these groups and communicate what needs to be done in a way that it's transparent and clear enough for the people to understand. For me, my first language is Greek. For you to be able to understand my English, I need to be working through it and also translating and speaking slowly so you can understand what I'm saying. This is how we need to do it. We need to engineer, in brackets, this common language that people can understand us further. I don't know if I have answered to your question.
Yes, brilliantly. And of course, this is about communication, but what we need to make sure is that the people we're communicating with, and certainly the people in the communities we're working with, they feel ownership and engagement. They feel engagement and ownership rather than having something imposed on them.
Yes.
I'm working. We have a fantastic panel tomorrow on lessons from the emergent South, from the global South. I mean, of course, the lessons from we tend to have the theory guys are in the North, and the people actually doing the stuff are in the South. I mean, that's basically the way it goes. But we have Nadine Sulkowski on there from University of Gloucester, and I worked with Nadine for 3 years on an EU program called Building Universities for Leading in Disaster Resilience in Indonesia. And basically in Indonesia, which of course is an incredibly high risk area in terms of major events. But within the outlying cities, the truth is that the university is probably the most mature organization, certainly more mature than the government. If you look at the quality of people there and their resources and their internationality and the fact that they have networks, they have capabilities, they are the most mature organization. And so we took 8 universities and helped create them as centers of excellence. Brilliant, brilliant program. But each of those universities had 3 vectors, 3 areas of influence that they had to work on as part of this program. The first was upwards to help government make better policy, to help use research and academia to help, and that can be local government, city government, regional government, state government, didn't matter, but whichever context you were operating in, help the government make better policy. The second vector was downwards, support and encourage and enable community ownership and engagement, and that's through training and through community initiatives and through community leadership programs, but they had to feel that they owned the program. And the third vector was outwards to create networks and help them make networks and go in their own local networks, business networks, and then to a certain extent, international networks. Brilliant program, and I think it's very transferable. Sherrod, Dr. Roseanne Smith, that's who I was thinking about, University of West Indies. We did a bit of work at the University of West Indies, and brilliant, absolutely brilliant work. I mean, really top, world-class work coming out of there. But I imagine that they are not just influencing what's happening within the Caribbean, but I imagine that they're learning lessons that is useful for the whole of the rest of the world in terms of how you sort of model and engage and deal with and build capabilities and capacities both across government agencies and across community networks. So what are your thoughts on that? Are you finding that the academic work is having an impact and influence on what you're doing?
Definitely, David. I think it's an excellent discussion with Andrew and Avgoustinos contributions because I straddle both sides because I'm both in the academic realm and I'm also in the practitioner's realm and having to deal with the community level. We see here that a lot of the work that has been done in the Caribbean out of practicality and experiences and everything and so on has helped them to develop their structure and strategies and so on, which actually has influenced things regionally and even up to the Sendai framework level. One of the things that I see a lot in terms of, because we are small and we try to work through a collaborative means, trying to get persons out of this silo mentality of thinking and operation. Because one of the things that you usually see is that from the practitioner side, they're very heavily focused on the functionality aspects of things. Whereas from the academics, they're very hung up on the modalities. And therefore, you really need to have them bring that back, because when you look at the trifecta, you're looking at, for example, the persons who are impacted civil society. Okay, so they need to understand, and we talk about education, and we don't want to pigeonhole education just to institutions and facilities. We're talking about education as a developmental practices, a developmental mechanism. So it's in all spheres. And how does that occur at the community level for civil society, within the training and practical aspects of our practitioners and so on, within the academic sphere? And how does that now filter and actually train and mold our decision makers, one, and also a very important component, which is the media, which has a very critical role in shaping the public discussion, discourse, and the public consciousness. So from the civil society level, you're really looking at how do you make, for example, the functionality and the concerns of the practitioners and so on relevant to civil society, that they understand where they plug into and what are their critical roles in terms of as cogs in the actual global or societal mechanism. From the practitioner's role, et cetera, and so on, where that knowledge, that tacit knowledge, that functional knowledge that they've gained over the years of working in the environment and living the experiences, how do we now relate that to the academic world, where they can now, because they are now looking at the theory, the whole practice, the modalities, the principalities behind it, et cetera, and so on. How do we make that germane to them? And then how do we make their work germane, not only to the practitioners, but at the community level, where they can now imbibe this and become a part of their normal day-to-day conversation, because you have to meet people where they are. And that, I think that is one of the things that we need to look at in terms of when we talk about education. What do we mean? When we talk about resilience, what do we mean? Because these things are very conceptual, contextual, and so on. So what does it mean in someone's mind? Because when you talk about resilience, if you talk about resilience to a practitioner, as opposed to an academic, as opposed to someone who was just in civil society being an impactee of somebody going through a flood or fire, you can get a lot of different ideas and concepts coming out. So in terms of our education aspect, when we are looking at this, we have to look at it from a holistic point of view. And in such, that means how we operate now needs to be looked at. What you just correctly said earlier, that when we're bringing people to the table, when we're looking at the beginning of things, the conceptual basis of this and so on, are we consulting? Because consultation, that's another conceptual term, because some persons think that, okay, I went, I had a meeting, I consulted. What were the outcomes of the meeting? What is the functional change? What is the behavioral change that you're seeing in terms of the internalization and so on? Because learning is internal to persons, okay? We go through the external means of trying to facilitate the environment, trying to facilitate the communication, trying to facilitate the understanding. But at the end of the day, it's the implementation, it's the behavioral change that we're looking for. That is what we really want to see, because that is what is going to translate into us being, one, more resilient, being able to respond, understanding why we need to do these things, making sure we prioritize certain things and so on, based on the decisions that are going to be taken that affect persons in a lot of sub-populations that may not have the direct capability or the direct power to actually mandate the change that they so need. But then we also have to look at that future aspect. How do we learn from the past to make sure that we can start to forecast? And when we start about forecasting, we're also looking at impact-based forecasting. What has happened in the past? What is changing now? What does that likely mean in the future? What are the capabilities we're likely going to have? Which means, how do we develop further on? And that now translates into a lot of things in terms of, for engineers, when they're designing our cities, are they taking into account the capabilities that we have for response agencies? What are the capabilities they're going to need to have? Because you want to have all these new projects. Okay, fine. What are the capabilities of your fire department? Because you know that's going to determine how high you build your buildings based on if you have to do vertical evacuation or rescue persons and so on. What are the capabilities they're going to need in terms of equipment, resources, training, sustainability aspects of it? So in terms of our procurement strategies, development and so on, how was our Ministry of Finance integrated into these agencies? One, to look at what are their needs, what are going to be their future needs, and how are we reporting on that to show the value of it to us as a society, so that when decision makers are seeing that, they understand that value. So are we talking, and do they have an understanding of that? Because when we talk in technical language, it's fine for technicians. We can break it down into common language for persons to understand. We can actually break it down or go deeper into it and everything, look at the principalities for technicians. But at the end of the day, how does that translate to the persons who are making decisions that are going to have major impacts on how we will be able to respond in the future? Just as you started out with that whole aspect about Katrina. Yeah, they were looking at conceptual things. Yeah, they were looking at technical things. But how did that translate into them actually forecasting what they would need to do in an environment when these particular measures or so on fail? Because you can only plan for certain things. Everything is within limits. What happens, that X factor, when you go forward? Past that, okay, have we developed the capability for us to be adaptive, dynamic, refocus, replan, and move forward?
Sherrod, the thing about it is though, as I think Andrew alluded to, this is a new reality. These are not outliers. These are not anomalous events. You can't have a once in 100-year flood every 3 years. 5 times in a row and still call it a once in 100-year flood. Or, they're talking about once in 1,000-year flood. What does that mean? That there's no historical continuity.